Karl Malone is the embodiment of greatness, built not through brilliant moments, but through the relentless repetition of hard work and discipline. Over 19 NBA seasons, he stepped onto the court like an unbreakable rule. Never late, never asking for time off, never allowing himself to weaken. People called him the mailman, the mail carrier who always delivers on time, because every game night, no matter the opponent, no matter how worn down his body was, Karl Malone showed up, collided, scored, and turned it into a habit. His 36,928 points were accumulated, not from rare explosive games, but from hundreds of quiet nights where he simply did his job. 2 MVP awards, 14 All-Star selections, 11 All-NBA first-team honors, nearly 2 decades as the irreplaceable pillar of the Utah Jazz, a small-market team that stayed in contention thanks to his durability. Alongside John Stockton, Malone formed the most effective pick-and-roll duo in NBA history, a cold, precise machine that forced the entire league to adjust without needing any spotlight. His career wasn't written with mythical moments, but with everyday games, unhighlighted collisions, forgotten Tuesday nights that added up to history. America honors Karl Malone as a symbol of labor, iron discipline, and the belief that greatness doesn't come from luck, but from showing up every day and getting the job done. But in that very consistency, a silent tragedy took shape. If someone never allows themselves to stop, what happens when their body and life force them to? Karl Malone didn't build his career on joy, but on the will to endure. Each passing season added another layer of pain to an already battered body, another morning waking up with a stiffer back, heavier knees, but still stepping onto the court as if there was no other choice. He didn't permit himself to be weak, because in the world that shaped him, weakness meant being left behind. The nights without fans, the unseen pains, the silent moments after games when the lights went out, Malone continued to carry the burden of having to be strong. That will made him a legend, but it also took away the ability to rest, to listen to his own body, to admit that humans have limits. He played not just to win, but to not collapse. And that paradox defined his entire life. Karl Malone was great because he didn't know how to stop, and precisely because he didn't know how to stop, he carried cracks that no championship could cover, cracks waiting for the day he had to face them when the cheers had gone silent. If you want to understand what forged a Karl Malone who never allowed himself to be weak, and what the true cost of that greatness was, subscribe to the channel to continue following the next part of the story. Thank you for joining us, and we'll dive deeper into the early years that shaped the mailman's tragedy in the next installment. Karl Malone didn't grow up with memories of fresh-baked bread or long hugs before bedtime. His childhood began and ended in labor, in silence, and in the feeling that he had to survive on his own without support. Summerfield, Louisiana, wasn't a place that nurtured dreams. It was a place that taught people how to endure. A poor, sparsely populated land, where life was tied to the fields, hunting, fishing, and repetitive heavy labor from dawn until dark. There, children weren't asked, "How do you feel?" but taught, "What can you do?" Karl Malone was born the youngest in a family of 9 siblings, and in such a large family, attention was never evenly divided. The older kids needed help, there were always more tasks than time, and young Karl learned very early that if he didn't stand on his own, no one would come back to pick him up. In that house, love wasn't something spoken out loud. It might have existed, but it was always buried under duty and discipline. His mother was exhausted from trying to hold the family together, with calloused hands and silent endurance. She had no time for gentle encouragement, no space for questions about feelings. And for the men around Karl, the world was divided very clearly, strong and weak, capable and incapable. In the South of America back then, men didn't cry, they worked, they endured, and if it hurt, they swallowed it as part of the duty to survive. Karl Malone grew up in that atmosphere, where tenderness was seen as a luxury and weakness as something dangerous. As the youngest, he was often overlooked, not because anyone hated him, but because no one had enough time to look back. No one asked if he was tired, no one asked if he was afraid, and young Karl learned to be silent as a survival instinct, silent when in pain, silent when forgotten, silent when feeling small in a world too big and too harsh. At an age when many other children were still allowed to fall and be picked up, Karl had to get up on his own. He worked alongside his siblings, carrying tasks beyond a child's strength, not to be praised, but to not become a burden. The feeling of not allowed to be weak didn't come from a taught lesson, but from the absence of any other choice. When no one comforts you, you learn to toughen up. When there's no place to pour out sorrow, you learn to bury it deep. The Southern man culture etched into Karl Malone an almost absolute belief. A man's worth lies in his ability to endure, not in words, not in emotions, but in the ability to keep moving when everything is heavy. And that belief gradually became the backbone of who he was. Karl didn't learn to love himself. He learned to use himself as a tool, body for work, will to overcome, heart locked away. Some children grow up in protective arms and carry gentle confidence throughout life. Karl Malone didn't have that privilege. What he carried was a quiet fear, fear of becoming useless, fear of being left behind, fear of being seen as weak. And that fear didn't make him fall, it made him hard as rock, hard to the point that no one could easily touch him, not even those who wanted to help. Karl's childhood had no fairy tales to tell. It only had days strung together, where the youngest boy learned to turn deprivation into motivation, loneliness into strength, and silence into armor. It was in that harsh environment that the biggest lesson of his life formed, not through words, but through experience. If you're not strong, you won't survive. That lesson not only helped Karl Malone survive a poor childhood in Louisiana, but followed him his whole life, leading him to greatness, while planting the seeds for tragedies he didn't yet know the names of at the time. The day silence entered Karl Malone's life wasn't marked by explosions or dramatic goodbyes. It came so lightly, it was cruel, as if the world simply closed a door and left, leaving behind a boy who hadn't yet understood what happened. Karl's father left in a way no one wanted to name, and in that poor Louisiana family, there was no room for long questions or conversations about pain. No one sat down to explain to Karl what loss was. No one taught him how to grieve, how to be angry, or how to cry. The adults were busy with what needed to be done, with the responsibility to keep living, and the youngest boy stood there, quietly, carrying a new void in his chest, without knowing where to put it. After his father's death, the house didn't get louder or quieter in a comforting way. It became heavier, thick, with things left unsaid. No one mentioned him anymore, as if saying the name of the lost could make everything collapse. Karl learned that some losses weren't allowed to be touched, that some questions, if asked, would only cause more pain for others, and so, he chose silence. Silence not because he didn't hurt, but because there was nowhere to place that pain. At an age too young to understand death, Karl only felt one thing very clearly: the world had suddenly become more fragile, and no one had enough time to face it with him. He still had to wake up, still had to work, still had to grow up as if nothing had changed. But inside him, an invisible line had been drawn. From that moment, Karl understood that if he fell, no one would pull him up. The loss didn't come with shared tears, but with the responsibility to endure alone. There was no ritual to release the pain, no lingering hugs, just quieter meals, longer evenings, and a boy learning to swallow sorrow like swallowing a stone. Karl didn't cry in front of others, not because he didn't hurt, but because he learned that tears changed nothing in the world he lived in. Crying didn't bring his father back. Crying didn't make work lighter. Crying didn't make anyone less tired. And so he locked his emotions tight, like a self-defense instinct. That silence didn't disappear over the years. It grew with Karl, followed him into adolescence, then adulthood. It became part of how he existed, an invisible armor shielding his heart. Karl learned to turn pain into action, emptiness into drive. Instead of talking about loss, he worked more. Instead of asking why it happened, he focused on making sure it didn't happen again in his way, by becoming strong enough that no one could abandon him. Some children grow up with memories of a father as comfort. Karl Malone grew up with the memory of absence, and that absence wasn't just one person, but a constant reminder that everything could disappear at any moment. That's why Karl hated feeling helpless. He hated having to wait for help. He hated having to reveal his needs to others. Because once he learned to live without a father, he also learned to live without needing anyone. From that day, Karl no longer cried in front of others. not because he became emotionless, but because he believed emotions had to be kept hidden to survive. Silence entered his life like an uninvited friend, staying so long it became familiar. It taught him how to stand firm in storms, but also took away the ability to seek comfort when needed. And it was in that early moment of loss that Karl Malone was shaped, not just as a boy who had to grow up too soon, but as a man who would later carry the whole world on his shoulders, while inside he remained the child who learned to endure pain alone, without tears, without complaints, only with silence that stretched through his entire life. After the day silence took root in his life, Karl Malone didn't turn to basketball as a dream, nor did he see it as a game that brought joy. For him, basketball appeared as an escape, a narrow door to step out of poverty, and out of the memories he didn't know where to put. In Louisiana, the future didn't open with choices, but with rare opportunities for those tough enough to seize them. Karl didn't grow up imagining himself as a star. He grew up with the fear of being trapped, of repeating a heavy, silent life like the ones he saw around him, and basketball, by chance or fate, became the only means of escape. On the dusty courts, Karl didn't seek applause. He sought safety. Each practice was a step back from poverty, a small distance between him and the helplessness that had followed him since his father's departure. Basketball didn't ask how he felt. It only asked how long he could endure. And that question Karl knew how to answer. He dove into training not because he loved the game, but because he understood that if he stopped, everything would return to the starting line. In his world, stopping always meant falling behind. Louisiana Tech wasn't a place of glory or sports fairy tales. No bright lights, no media frenzy, no sense of being chosen. Karl entered it like someone clinging to driftwood in rushing water. He wasn't favored, wasn't sheltered. Every day at Louisiana Tech was a test of whether he was tough enough to continue. No one promised the NBA. No one guaranteed a different future. All Karl had was his body and a quiet determination. He had to make use of everything, because there was no second chance. There Karl Malone learned a habit that would follow him his whole life, practicing when others rested. When teammates left the gym, he stayed. When others saw pain as a sign to stop, he saw it as something to overcome. The pains became familiar background noise, like wind or rain. No one stood by asking if he was okay, and Karl didn't expect it. He had learned to hurt without complaining, because complaining didn't take him further. In every drop of sweat on the gym floor, there was both fear and determination, but no room for weakness. Basketball gradually became the place Karl escaped from himself, escaping the old house, the heavy silent evenings, the memory of an absent father and unnamed sorrow. On the practice court, everything was simpler. There were drills to complete, clear goals, measurable numbers. No need to face emotions. No need to explain pain, just keep running, keep lifting, keep colliding. In that repetition, Karl found a cold kind of peace, where he could exist without needing to understand what he felt. But that escape didn't heal, it only helped him move forward. Each step forward left another layer of emotion behind, buried deep under discipline and habit. Karl Malone didn't learn to love basketball in a romantic sense. He learned to use it. Use it to get stronger, to go further, to not have to return to where he started. And that's why basketball became what shaped him. A man who believed value lay in endurance, that emotions were a burden to set aside. At Louisiana Tech, no one called Karl a star, but no one could deny his heavy presence. He didn't shine with smiles or flair. He was present with steadfastness, with always being there, with never giving up. That wasn't the image of a boy chasing dreams, but of someone running from a past he wasn't ready to face. And in that escape, Karl Malone laid the first bricks for his later great career, while also building a thick wall between himself and his own emotions. Basketball, for Karl Malone, was never a place of healing. It didn't soothe the losses, didn't fill the emptiness in his heart. It only gave him a path to keep walking, a path full of sweat, pain and discipline, where he could move forward without looking back. And in that moment, Karl believed that was enough. He didn't yet know that using basketball as an escape, rather than a place to stop and heal, would follow him his whole life. bringing the greatness America honored, while planting the seeds for quiet tragedies he would face when there was nowhere left to run. The 1985 NBA draft didn't open before Karl Malone like a door of glory, but like a narrow threshold he stepped through with more doubt than hope. No moment of being called as destiny, no promises of the future. Just the cold number 13, a pick high enough to survive, but not high enough to be trusted. Pick 13. In the NBA, that wasn't the position of those seen as the face of the league. It was the position of potential players, names that needed time, chosen to fill gaps rather than lead. Karl Malone stepped onto the draft stage without the glow of a college star, without the certainty that he belonged there. He only brought a solid body, a modest resume, and a habit ingrained from childhood. He had to prove himself or be forgotten. The Utah Jazz selected Karl Malone, and with that choice came another harsh reality. Utah wasn't Los Angeles, Boston, or New York. It was a small market, low lights, little media, little patience for experiments. There no one waited for a rookie to learn. Either you were useful, or you vanished in silence. Karl understood that from the first days. He didn't enter the NBA locker room feeling like he'd arrived. He entered with the fear of being cut, the fear of not being good enough, the fear that everything he'd endured from Louisiana to Louisiana Tech, and now here still wasn't enough to keep him there. In many people's eyes, Karl Malone at that time was just a big, strong body, but rough. Not the future of the league, not a ticket seller, not a name that made opponents change plans. He wasn't described as a gem to polish, but as a worker who could be used immediately if he met the requirements. And Karl accepted that position, not because he was satisfied, but because he had no other choice. He had learned long ago that the world didn't give you trust first. It forced you to earn it day by day. The first NBA practices didn't bring a feeling of victory. They brought awakening. Karl realized he was no longer the strongest in the room. The collisions were heavier, other bodies were just as hard as steel, and here no one cared where you came from or what you'd endured. They only cared how long you could stand. Karl began living in a constant state of challenge, always on the edge of being replaced. Every game was a test, every mistake a question mark, and every morning waking up, he wondered if he still had a place. No one believed Karl Malone would become a cornerstone. At times even he didn't believe it. The doubt didn't come as boos, it came in tiny moments when his name wasn't mentioned in predictions, when people's eyes slid past him as if he were only a temporary option. Karl was used to being underestimated, but the NBA made that feeling sharper. Here not being strong enough meant you didn't exist, and he knew that to survive, he couldn't rely on praise. There wouldn't be much of that for him anyway. So Karl Malone chose the familiar path, do more than was required. He showed up earlier, stayed later, took every collision without stepping back, not to impress anyone but to convince himself he belonged. Every day he put his body through trials, as if slowing down even once would make everything collapse. In that brutal NBA world, Karl didn't allow himself to dream. He only allowed himself to exist. The Utah Jazz didn't draft Karl Malone because they believed he'd become a legend. They drafted him because they thought he could work. And Karl entered the league with exactly that mindset, as a laborer, not a star. No one fully believed in him. No guarantees, no privileges, just a fragile spot he had to hold with sweat and pain. And in those early days, while all the lights pointed at other names, Karl Malone stood there carrying the world's doubt, and his own, preparing for a long war he didn't yet know would last nearly 2 decades, and take far more than he imagined. When Karl Malone entered the NBA as a player no one trusted, he understood one thing clearly: talent alone wasn't enough to survive. In a league where bodies crashed like molten metal, where every spot had someone else ready to take it, Karl chose the only way he knew from his poor Louisiana childhood: turn himself into something impossible to ignore, and that path began by building a body that was never allowed to say no. Karl Malone didn't train to look good or to show off. He trained like every session was survival. His body became the biggest project of his life, forged by ruthless discipline and unforgiving repetition. When teammates finished practice, Karl stayed. When others rested because they hurt, he kept lifting. When coaches suggested saving energy, he treated it like a luxury suggestion. For Karl, rest was a privilege for people who were trusted, and he never felt safe enough to claim that privilege. Every muscle fiber on Malone's body wasn't formed by inspiration, it was formed by fear. Fear of being cut, fear of being deemed not good enough, fear of returning to the poor, silent life he had fled. So he pushed his body past limits others wouldn't dare touch. Every time it hurt, he didn't ask why, he asked, how much longer can I take it?
Echt?
That question followed him into the gym, into every game, into every morning when he woke up heavier than the day before. Karl Malone didn't treat his body like something to protect. He treated it like a tool that had to keep running, like a machine programmed to absorb collisions, fatigue and pain without breaking down. In the weight room he learned to listen to his breathing, not to rest, but to know how much more he could demand. During brutal workouts, he wasn't chasing satisfaction, he was chasing the assurance that tomorrow he would still be strong enough to survive. Slowly, Karl's durability became something that stunned people. He rarely missed games, rarely sat out, rarely let his body decide for him. Malone walked onto the court like a man always ready to collide, as if every fall was acceptable as long as he got up fast enough. Coaches trusted that reliability, teammates leaned on that presence, and the entire league started treating Karl Malone like a constant, something that was always there, always able to take it, always continuing. But the creation of that machine was also when Karl began losing the line between endurance and self-destruction. He no longer distinguished between signals to stop and limits to respect. Every pain became proof he was doing it right. The more it hurt, the more it mattered. The more tired he was, the more it proved he existed. Karl didn't listen to his body like a human. He listened like a supervisor checking a machine, only caring whether it still worked. There were nights after games when his body hurt so much he couldn't sleep, and Karl didn't ask if he should slow down. He only asked if he could still train tomorrow. No one had taught him that pain could be a warning. In the world he grew up in, pain was just something to get through. And in the NBA, where everything moved fast and hard, that mindset wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. Karl Malone became the model of toughness, of never backing down, but few saw the price quietly piling up. His body gradually became something he used, not something he cared for. Each season, the collisions didn't fade after a few days anymore, they lingered, deeper. But Karl didn't change. He didn't allow weakness, because in his mind weakness always meant being left behind. So he kept pushing himself into the same cycle: train, play, endure, repeat. The first price of that path didn't come as a major injury or an obvious collapse. It came more subtly. Karl Malone slowly forgot how to listen to himself, forgot how to tell fatigue from danger, forgot how to ask what he needed besides continuing. Emotions, like his body, became things he could set aside if they interfered with performance. He didn't allow himself to stop and wonder if he was happy, because that question didn't help him survive in the NBA. The making of the machine, Karl Malone created a player the entire league had to respect, but it also created a man growing further and further from himself. Every day he stepped on the court, stronger and more dependable in others' eyes, but quieter about the signals inside. He didn't realize that while building a body that never said no, he was also learning to never say enough. And that was the most dangerous lesson he carried through his career, that his worth lay in how much he could endure, not in what was left of him after enduring too long. When Karl Malone had turned his body into a machine that didn't know refusal, fate brought him John Stockton, and together they created one of the most enduring and efficient symbols in NBA history. The Stockton to Malone pick and roll wasn't flashy basketball that made crowds jump in awe. It was cold, precise, repeated to the point of brutality. A perfectly timed pass, a familiar cut, a catch, turn, score. Over and over. No need for excess creativity, no need for sudden inspiration, just two men who understood their jobs and never failed at them. The whole league knew what was coming, yet still couldn't stop it. And in that simplicity, the Utah Jazz became a force that was always there, season after season. For Stockton and Malone, glory didn't come from explosive moments, it came from reliability. They didn't play to be loved. They played to win in the most efficient way possible. Stockton passed like a silent worker. Malone finished like a man programmed to complete the task. Between them there were no warm hugs, no wild celebrations. Their relationship was built on respect and duty, not emotion. Two different men who met at one common point, both put the job above joy. Under that duo, the Utah Jazz became a team no one could take lightly. They weren't a collection of flashy stars, but they were always there, quietly advancing deep into the playoffs, forcing bigger, louder teams to prepare carefully. Malone and Stockton gave the Jazz a unique identity: discipline, durability, no mercy. It was basketball that wore opponents down, earned respect from neutral fans, but rarely moved anyone's heart. And Karl Malone slowly realized a bitter truth: success could arrive without joy. In the locker room, the atmosphere was rarely light. Every game was treated like a duty, every mistake dissected. Malone carried the role of the one who had to finish everything, the one who made sure the team's effort didn't go to waste. Stockton, with his calm demeanor, carried the burden of controlling tempo, of making the right decision in a split second. Between them there wasn't much talk, because both understood words didn't make them stronger, responsibility did. Karl Malone began living in a rhythm so repetitive, it became numbing. Season after season, playoffs after playoffs, the Utah Jazz were always there, good enough to compete, strong enough to be feared, but deep down, Malone rarely felt pure joy. Wins didn't bring relief. They only confirmed he wasn't allowed to stop yet. Every time he stepped on the court, he carried not just the team's expectations, but an entire system that had grown used to leaning on his durability. And when everyone is used to you always being strong, they stop asking if you're okay. That legendary pick and roll, in the end, was the perfect symbol of Karl Malone's life. It was effective but not romantic, precise but not gentle. It won by grinding opponents down, the same way Malone ground himself down. Every catch and score was a reminder he was doing his job, but nothing in it healed the voids he carried from childhood, from the silence after his father's death, from the years he learned not to cry in front of others. The Utah Jazz were always in the race, but rarely seen as the team of joy. No flamboyant stars, no easy romantic stories. And Karl Malone, even at the peak of his career, still felt he was living a journey with no room for relief. He didn't allow himself to relax, because the moment he did, he feared everything would collapse, feared his body would betray him, feared his role would be taken, feared his value would disappear when he was no longer perfect. There were nights after wins, when the crowd had gone and the arena lights dimmed, that Karl sat alone quietly unwrapping tape, feeling every small accumulated pain in his body. Those weren't moments of pride. They were moments of vague realization that joy had been traded away long ago. He didn't know exactly when he stopped playing basketball for fun and started playing only because he had to, but he knew that if he didn't keep going, if he didn't maintain that cycle, he would have to face the things basketball had helped him avoid for years. Two men, Stockton and Malone, together built a greatness history can't ignore, but it was greatness without laughter, without freedom, only cold respect and shared burden. They didn't share joy, they shared responsibility. And in that partnership, Karl Malone found the stability he needed to survive in the NBA, but also gradually lost the ability to enjoy his own journey. Success came to Karl Malone steadily, like mail delivered on time. The Utah Jazz kept showing up, season after season, as proof of discipline and endurance. But joy didn't come with it. It was left somewhere on the path Karl had chosen, buried under endless practices, tense games and responsibilities that never lightened. And looking back on that glorious era, the most painful thing wasn't what he didn't achieve. It was the feeling that even at his most successful, Karl Malone was still a man carrying a heavy load, rather than a human truly living. The years Karl Malone reached his individual peak were also when the loneliness inside him became clearer than ever. On paper, this was the period any player dreams of: MVP awards, all-star selections, scoring milestones NBA history can't overlook. Malone stood in the spotlight, celebrated as the perfect power forward of his era, a model of strength, discipline, and unshakable durability. To the public, it was the deserved reward for a lifetime of tireless work. But for Karl, those honors didn't bring fulfillment. They only confirmed one thing: he still wasn't allowed to stop. The MVP award didn't come to Malone as an emotional explosion. It came as a checkmark next to a list of completed tasks. He accepted it, smiled properly, then went back to the gym. No release, no relief. In Karl Malone's inner world, rewards were never the finish line. They were just reminders that tomorrow's expectations would be even higher. When the league saw him as the standard, he had to maintain that standard at any cost. All-Star became routine. Mid-season trips, formal introductions, endless applause. Karl Malone showed up as a familiar face, part of the scenery, but that familiarity didn't bring belonging. In hotel rooms far from home, when the noise died down, he was back with his aching body and a nameless exhaustion. Each honor was another coat of paint on the outside image, but inside, Karl was still the man who didn't know how to rest. Points kept piling up, game after game, season after season. The numbers climbed the all-time charts, putting him in conversations with the greatest legends. People talked about Malone's extraordinary consistency, his ability to score in any situation, how time seemed unable to touch him. But few asked what was being worn away to pay for that stability. Every collision for 2 more points was a reminder his body wasn't immortal. Every passing season, the pains no longer disappeared after a few days off. They stayed, quietly, waiting for night. Karl Malone's MVP-era nights had no glow. They were full of aches and silence. While teammates rested, he lay there listening to his body react to what it had endured. But he didn't let himself see it as a warning. For Karl, pain was just proof he was still working. Stopping had never been an option. He didn't know how to stop, because since he was a boy in Louisiana, stopping had always meant danger. Awards for Malone didn't heal exhaustion. They covered it. They created a shell that made others believe he was fine, that he was living the dream. But that dream had no room for sleepless nights, for mornings waking up heavier than yesterday. Karl Malone had no language to talk about his burnout. He only had the habit of continuing. And when you become the symbol of continuing, the world stops giving you permission to admit you're tired. There were rare moments, looking at the stat sheet or hearing his name alongside legends, when Karl felt a flash of pride. But that feeling was quickly drowned by a quiet question: and then what? He had achieved what the system demanded, but didn't feel filled. Success didn't bring peace. It only pulled him faster down the path he already walked alone. The MVP years were also when Karl Malone began facing a hard truth. The body has limits, but the will doesn't know when to stop. That gap created a constant tension. He forced the body to keep up with the spirit, and the spirit was fed by fear of being left behind. That fear didn't vanish when you became MVP. It just changed shape. Instead of fearing he wasn't good enough, he feared he couldn't stay at the top. Instead of fearing being forgotten, he feared losing the image he had built. Karl Malone began to understand, though he didn't dare name it, that trophies couldn't heal what was building up inside. No cup could soothe years of exhaustion. No applause could replace a full night's sleep. But understanding didn't mean changing. He still stepped on the court, still scored, still carried the load. Because if he didn't, he would have to face the question he had avoided his whole life. If he was no longer Karl Malone on the basketball court, then who was he? And so the MVP years passed in a bitter paradox. On the outside, Karl Malone was the image of success, of near mechanical perfection. On the inside, he was a man growing increasingly weary, carrying empty nights and nameless pains. Success came steadily, but joy didn't keep pace. Awards piled up, but relief never arrived. And in those quiet nights, Karl Malone slowly realized a truth he wasn't ready to fully face. Greatness can take you to the highest peak, but it doesn't guarantee rest once you're there. If Karl Malone's entire career was a silent climb up a mountain, then the 1997-1998 seasons were the moment he touched the summit, only to realize paradise could vanish in an instant. It wasn't just failure. It was the central tragedy of his playing life, a spiritual wound so deep it never fully healed, no matter how much time passed. Karl Malone's Utah Jazz entered that period with everything they had built: experience, discipline, cold stability. Malone was already an MVP. Stockton was still the tireless brain. They weren't young anymore, but they were seasoned. No one doubted they were good enough to win a title. The only question left was, would time wait for them? Because on the other side stood the Chicago Bulls of Michael Jordan, the ultimate standard of victory, the embodiment of the unbeatable. The 1997 finals unfolded like a final test for both worlds. One side was the Jazz, representing endurance, labor, unflashy sacrifice. The other was the Bulls, the embodiment of glory, power, and moments. Karl Malone entered that series as the centerpiece, carrying not just Utah on his shoulders, but his entire life story. He didn't talk much, he didn't celebrate early, but in his eyes, there was a quiet belief that all those years of pain and persistence might finally be rewarded. And then the moment came. Game 1. The Jazz had a chance to seal the game at the free throw line. Karl Malone stood there alone, in the heavy silence of the arena, not because he was weak, not because he lacked nerve, but because that moment was bigger than anything he'd ever experienced. Jordan stood nearby, whispering something no one heard clearly, but enough to break the rhythm of the moment. 2 free throws missed. Bulls win. Utah loses home court advantage, and a tiny seed of doubt was planted deep in Karl Malone's mind. The series dragged on, tense, full of collisions and fatigue. The Jazz fought the way they always had, no flair, no quitting. Malone scored, banged, endured. But the Bulls had Jordan, and Jordan didn't need much. He just needed the right moment. When the 1997 finals ended with the championship going to Chicago, Karl Malone stood there, not collapsing, not crying, just silent. Once again he swallowed failure, like he'd swallowed every pain in his life. But this failure was different. It wasn't just a loss. It was the feeling of being so close, close enough to touch, and still not enough. In 1998, Utah returned. No longer naive, no longer dreaming, just raw determination. This might be the last chance. Karl Malone aged another year, his body added pains that didn't fade, but he didn't allow himself to think about it. The 1998 finals wasn't a battle of hope, it was a battle of fate. The Jazz faced the Bulls again, as if the universe wanted to test Karl to the limit. Game 6, Salt Lake City. Utah led in the final minutes, just a few moments away. The ring was right there, not in a dream, not in imagination. It was so close the entire arena held its breath. Karl Malone scored. Jazz led. Jordan had the ball. And then the moment happened. The moment history calls the last shot. Jordan stole the ball from Malone. A quick cut. A hesitation. A shot. The ball fell through. Chicago led again. Utah couldn't answer. The game ended. The finals ended. The dream ended. In a few fleeting seconds, everything Karl Malone had built over nearly 2 decades vanished like smoke. There was no dramatic collapse, no tears on camera. Karl Malone stood there, quietly, like a man too accustomed to not being allowed to break. But inside, something shattered. This wasn't a failure he could fix with more practice, not pain he could endure to be stronger tomorrow. This was the moment he began to understand that some things in sports and in life don't depend on how hard you try. Jordan left the court with history in hand. Malone left with a question that would follow him forever. What more could I have done? He had practiced more, endured more, never rested, never backed down, never weakened, but still not enough. And that was the most painful truth a man like Karl Malone could face, because if failure didn't come from lack of effort, then where did it come from? After 1998, Karl Malone was no longer the same man. He still played, still scored, still stayed strong, but a part of him stayed forever in that moment when Jordan took the final shot. A part that believed everything could be solved with hard work was wounded. A part realized that the fairness he'd believed in his whole life didn't always exist. This was the moment Karl Malone never fully overcame, not because he was weak, but because he had poured his entire self into that ring. When it slipped away, It wasn't just a title that vanished, it was the meaning of his endurance that shook. And from then on, though he kept moving forward, Karl Malone always carried the memory of a paradise he touched, and then lost in just a few seconds. A memory that shaped how he viewed his career, his life, and himself forever after. After Jordan's final shot, what remained for Karl Malone wasn't just a season that ended. It was a lingering aftershock that lasted the rest of his career. The failure didn't stop at the scoreboard. It spread beyond the court, into how people looked at him, called him, and ultimately defined him. From that moment, Karl Malone was no longer mentioned first as one of the greatest players to ever play. He was mentioned as an unanswered question. No ring. Those two short words became a hanging sentence over every conversation about his legacy. In the American sports world, the ultimate victory is the ring. Not points, not durability, not 2 MVP awards. Everything can be retold, but the ring cannot be replaced. And as Karl Malone moved into the later stages of his career, every analysis, every ranking, every TV debate began with the same cold conclusion: great, but no championship. As if all those years of endurance, every collision, every painful night shrank down to a single void. Karl Malone felt that change clearly. He didn't need to read the papers to know. He heard it in the tone, saw it in the way questions were asked. Before, he was asked how he stayed in form, about the secret to his durability. Now he was asked why he couldn't finish it, why he always fell short by one step, why he wasn't the final winner. Those questions weren't seeking answers. They were seeking a label, and that label slowly stuck to him. Karl Malone's legacy was weighed in the cruelest way. People began sorting history like a priority list, where names with rings ranked higher, and he was pushed down as an awkward exception. No one denied his greatness, but the acknowledgement always came with a caveat, and that caveat hurt more than outright denial, because it turned his entire career into an endless defense. Karl Malone didn't respond with tears or complaints. He responded the way he'd learned since childhood, by closing off, becoming defensive, no longer trusting the media, because the media didn't seek the full truth. They sought the easiest story. And the easiest story about Karl Malone was a man without a ring. He began avoiding deep interviews, avoiding conversations where failure was rehashed like an unhealed wound, not because he didn't accept reality, but because he was tired of explaining it over and over. The further into the twilight of his career, the more Karl felt defined by what he lacked rather than everything he had accomplished. The numbers grew cold. Individual awards became consolation prizes. Everything he achieved seemed to exist only to highlight the absence of the championship ring, and that hurt not because of the missing title, but because it felt like his life's effort was being unfairly reduced to a single gap. Karl's defensiveness wasn't arrogance. It was the self-protection of a man who had given too much. He no longer believed hard work would speak for itself, because if it did, he wouldn't have to hear those questions. He began to believe the world needed simple symbols, and complicated people like him would always be misunderstood. So he chose silence more, explained less, opened up less. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he no longer believed words could change how people wanted to see him. There were nights, looking back on his career, when Karl Malone wondered if he'd placed too much value on a single goal. Not the ring itself, but the recognition that came with it. He'd lived his whole life believing that if he worked hard enough, endured enough, fairness would come. But the harsh reality after 1998 showed him that history doesn't always follow that formula. And being judged without mercy made him close up tighter, harden more, like returning to the boy who learned to survive in silence. Karl Malone kept playing, kept scoring, kept showing up, but the last shred of innocence was gone. Every time he stepped on the court, he knew that no matter how well he played, the ring question would still be there. It didn't need to be spoken. It hung in the air. And the feeling of being defined by that absence became the heaviest mental burden of his final years. He no longer sought public affection. He no longer tried to change the story. Karl Malone accepted the role of the misunderstood, rather than continue fighting in a debate where the rules were already set. But that acceptance didn't bring peace. It only brought calluses, a thicker skin to endure the next judgments. And so, after touching paradise and losing it, Karl Malone stepped into the next chapter of his life with a bitter paradox. He was one of the greatest players who ever lived, yet always viewed through the lens of what he lacked. A man who gave everything, but history held him back by a single void. No ring, no perfect moment, just a massive career overshadowed by unforgiving judgment, and a man increasingly closing himself off from a world that chose to tell his story in the simplest and most painful way. When the noise on the court finally quieted, when the story of the missing championship ring became a hanging sentence, another shadow, deeper, heavier, began to fall over Karl Malone's name. This was no longer about basketball. This was about his personal life. And unlike athletic failure, where effort could still be credited, what belonged to his private life never had a fair scorecard to explain or close. In the early years of his career, when Karl Malone was young and still carried the roughness of a man raised in poverty and emotional neglect, his personal life didn't follow the ideal template the American public often expects from sports heroes. Before marriage, Karl had relationships that left lasting consequences, children born outside the nuclear family framework, outside the good wife, good kid story that sports media loves. To the public, it wasn't just private matter. It quickly became a moral controversy that lasted years, sticking to his name like an indelible stain. Karl Malone was never good at telling his own story. He never even tried. Faced with the barrage of information, the public outrage, he didn't stand up with long defenses, didn't do tearful interviews, didn't try to soften his image. He chose silence. A familiar silence, like the one he'd chosen since his father's death, since he learned that showing emotion didn't help survival. But this time silence wasn't armor. It became an empty space for others to fill with judgment. The media didn't need many details to tell a shocking story. Karl Malone's private life was stripped of context, of his hard upbringing, of the lack of emotional guidance, and placed under the harsh spotlight of public morality. He was no longer seen as a complex human, but as a flawed icon. To many, those controversies were enough to overshadow every on-court achievement. To others, it created an irreconcilable divide. How can you celebrate a sports legend when his personal life carries such stains? Karl Malone didn't argue back, didn't apologize publicly in the way people expected, didn't explain circumstances, didn't cite youth or ignorance. He kept living the only way he knew, avoiding, withdrawing, letting time pass. But time in this case didn't heal the wound. It only made the story heavier because silence doesn't equal forgiveness. And every time Karl Malone's name came up in legacy debates, that shadow reappeared, forcing people to choose a side. For Karl himself, this was perhaps the hardest chapter to face. On the court, he could train more, get stronger, endure more to make up for shortcomings. But in personal life, there was no drill to fix the past, no title to balance ethical questions. He didn't know how to confront the hurt he caused, nor how to express regret in language the public would accept. And so he chose the most familiar way: silence and keep moving, carrying the unnamed burden. From then on, Karl Malone's legacy was torn in two. One half was the basketball legend, the mailman delivering on time for nearly 2 decades, the symbol of labor, discipline, and extraordinary endurance. The other half was a deeply controversial man, with personal choices many couldn't accept. Those two halves existed side by side, inseparable yet never fully reconciled. Anyone mentioning Karl Malone had to face that paradox. Some legends get polished smoother by history over time. Karl Malone's didn't. Time didn't make that shadow disappear. It only made the contrast clearer. He wasn't an easy figure to love, nor one to fully deny. He was proof of an uncomfortable truth. A person can be great in one area and deeply flawed in another. And society, especially American society, always struggles to accept both at once. Karl Malone never found a way to fully mend those two halves of his legacy. He didn't rewrite his story more gently. He didn't try to erase what happened. He left it there like a parallel shadow, weighty but familiar. And perhaps, deep down, he understood that some stains can't be erased, only carried, not to justify, not to boast, but as part of the full truth about who he was. a man history could never tell in a single color. After everything that had passed, Karl Malone entered the 2003-2004 season as a man with nothing left to prove, but still one thing he craved. The ring just once, not to change the past, but to close it. When he left the Utah Jazz, after nearly 2 decades of loyalty, it wasn't betrayal, it was a quiet admission. Time hadn't waited for him, and if the dream had any chance left, it could only survive somewhere else. The Los Angeles Lakers opened that door. A roster seemingly built to fix fate. Shaquille O'Neal, Kobe Bryant, Gary Payton, and Karl Malone. 4 names, 4 legacies, 1 goal. The media called it a super team, a championship already scheduled. But Karl Malone didn't believe in easy promises. He had lived too long to understand nothing is given for free. At 40 he walked into the Lakers' locker room with a worn body, but eyes still full of determination. He didn't come to be a symbol, he came to work. Karl Malone's body was no longer an invincible machine. The pains no longer appeared only at night. They followed him onto the court. Every run was a negotiation with his knees, his back, with the accumulated scars from nearly 20 years. But the desire didn't fade. If there was one thing that never wore down, it was the belief that he still had one more chance to try, not for glory, but for completion. Karl Malone didn't want to end his career as an open question. The season didn't unfold as smoothly as people imagined. The Lakers didn't operate like a perfect machine. There were egos, conflicts, nights of fractures. Karl tried to do his job, collide, score, carry the quiet responsibility. He didn't demand attention. He didn't need the spotlight. He just needed to stand on the court in June. But fate, as it had so many times before, didn't change its treatment of him. The knee injury struck at the moment he could least accept it. Karl had to sit out, watching the season slip away in helplessness. For a man who had lived his entire life by never stopping, being forced to stop was a brutal mental punishment. He returned, no longer the best version of himself, but still trying, because if this was the last time, he wanted it to happen on the court, not on the bench. The Lakers reached the finals. Their opponents were the Detroit Pistons, a team without flash, without superstars in the media sense, but disciplined and cold. An image painfully familiar to Karl Malone. As if history was holding up a mirror to him, the series passed with a sense of unease. The Lakers couldn't find their rhythm. Karl fought with whatever was left in his body. Every possession was a trade-off, but no miracle came. The Pistons won. The dream ended. That final moment wasn't loud. There was no fateful shot like in 1998, just a slow, certain, irreversible end. Karl Malone stood there, once again one step away from the ring that he couldn't cross. This time he no longer had the energy to ask, "What more could I have done?" Because he had done everything. His body had given its last. His will had run dry. That final season was the most beautiful and cruel illusion in Karl Malone's life. It gave him hope that fate could be rewritten, then immediately reminded him that some stories have no chapter of correction. When it all ended, he wasn't angry. He didn't blame. There was only a heavy acceptance. Perhaps this time he understood that the ring wasn't something life had reserved for him. Karl Malone left the NBA not as a winner, but as a man who had reached the end of his road. The last touch of the dream was also the last time he let it slip from his hands. Not for lack of effort, not for lack of courage, but because sometimes fate isn't decided by what we do right, but by what we can't control. And in that final silence, Karl Malone closed his career the way he had lived, standing tall, enduring, and carrying regret that no title could replace. When the 2003-2004 season ended, and Karl Malone left the court for the last time, what was lost wasn't just a career, it was an entire structure of life. For nearly 30 years, from the dusty courts in Louisiana to the blazing finals nights, his life had been measured by schedules, practices, and opening whistles. And then suddenly, it all stopped. No more schedule to cling to, no more rushed flights, no more locker room, no more cheers, just a morning so quiet it was terrifying, where Karl Malone woke up not knowing what he needed to do next. That void wasn't rest, it was a free fall. For a man accustomed to living under pressure, silence didn't bring peace, It exposed everything that had been covered. Karl's body, once considered a machine that never said no, now began to speak in the most brutal way. Knees aching with every stand, back stiff every morning, the pains he had once ignored thanks to game adrenaline were no longer suppressed. They were there, clear, persistent, reminding him that time had taken its toll. But physical pain wasn't what unsettled Karl Malone the most. What left him lost was an empty mind. His whole life, he knew who he was when he stepped on the court. A man who carried responsibility. A man not allowed to be weak. A man who always had to complete his job. Now with no court left, he lost the language to define himself. No one needed him to score. No one needed him to block. No one needed him to grit through pain. And when he was no longer needed, Karl didn't know what he existed for. The early days after retirement passed slowly. No countdown to the next game. No short-term goals to hold on to. Karl Malone, who once controlled every hour of his day with iron discipline, now faced empty stretches of time. He sat there, listening to the silence, and realized that for years he had used the noise of basketball to avoid hearing himself. Friends and media called it a new life, but for Karl, it felt like a dismantling. Everything that had made him was taken away at once. He was no longer the Mailman of the NBA, he was just Karl Malone, and that name, stripped bare, felt unfamiliar. The questions he had once pushed away with practice and games now rose uncontrollably. What had he lived for? If that burden was gone, who was he? There were days Karl Malone tried to fill the void with activity, manual labor, being outdoors, attaching himself to tangible things, but no matter what he did, he still felt something missing, because what he lacked wasn't work to do, it was the feeling of being needed. His whole life, he had been accustomed to carrying loads, accustomed to people relying on him. When the burden vanished, he didn't feel lighter, he felt weightless, like an object drifting without direction. No more cheers also meant no more validation. On the court, every score, every game was an affirmation that he was doing right. Off the court, there was no scorecard for life, no final buzzer to signal that you had done enough. Karl Malone had never learned to live without that validation, and so, in silence, he began to understand that he had spent his life learning how to endure, but never how to exist when he no longer had to endure. People used to carrying burdens often don't know what to do when the burden is set down. For Karl Malone, retirement didn't bring freedom, it brought profound confusion. He could no longer run away, no more court to hide in, no more schedule to shield him. Just him, an aching body, an empty mind, and a life that had to be rebuilt from the beginning, not with strength, but with facing it. And that was the greatest challenge Karl Malone ever faced. Not Jordan, not the Bulls, not the championship ring, but learning to live in silence when all the noise had stopped, when there was no role to cling to, and when the man once defined by responsibility had to ask a question he had never been ready to answer. If there was no longer anything on his shoulders, did he know how to live for himself? At 62, Karl Malone is no longer the man standing in the spotlight, nor the icon debated on television every night. He enters the present as a legend who has stepped out of his role, carrying scars that neither time nor words can erase. His life now isn't a search for redemption, but a process of learning to live with what cannot be fixed. No seeking forgiveness, no trying to rewrite the story, just continuing to exist, quietly, the way he has long been accustomed. Post-NBA health is a constant reminder of the price of durability. The body that was once a weapon has become a limitation, joints worn from years of collisions, back, knees, feet, everything speaks without mercy. No more adrenaline to mask the pain, no more practice schedule to distract it. There are mornings he wakes slowly, cautious with every movement, like a man relearning how to live in his own body. That's not dramatic tragedy, it's the steady truth of age, of a life that never rested. Karl Malone lives with his family in a much more private way than many imagine. No showmanship, no explanations. Family, for him, isn't a story to tell the public, it's a reality to be responsible for. There are relationships maintained in silence, distances that can't be closed, and memories that must be carried with no escape. He doesn't stand in front of cameras to explain, nor seek collective sympathy. He understands that some things, no matter how many times spoken, won't change how others feel, and he accepts that as part of present life. Staying out of sight is a choice, not avoidance. Karl Malone no longer needs a stage to confirm who he is. The years defined by the missing championship ring, the thing he didn't have, taught him a bitter lesson about the noise of judgment. Now he chooses silence not out of fear, but because he no longer believes words can heal cracks formed long ago. Silence for him is breathing space, the final boundary, keeping the present from being torn apart by the past. At this age, Karl Malone isn't seeking to be loved. He isn't asking to be understood. He isn't waiting for history's verdict to reverse. He keeps living, with discipline deeply ingrained, but adjusted to a body that no longer obeys. Some days he's outdoors, doing manual work, finding the familiar rhythm of labor, not to prove anything, but to stay balanced. Some days he stays quiet, letting the pain pass without resistance. No heroics, no melodrama, just acceptance. Karl Malone's legacy, at this point, exists in an incomplete state, and he himself seems to have come to terms with it. He understands that he will always be remembered in two parallel ways, as a legend of endurance on the court and as a man carrying unerasable controversies. No perfect bridge connects those two sides, and he no longer tries to build one. Reconciliation, if it exists, happens only inside, between what he achieved and what he couldn't fix. No redemption, just acceptance. That is the attitude shaping Karl Malone in the present. He doesn't seek a beautiful ending. He accepts a real ending, a life built on labor, paid for with his body, remembered by cold numbers and burning questions. At 62, Karl Malone doesn't need exoneration to keep living. He just needs to live, with the scars, with the limits, with the truth that some things are never complete, but can still be carried honestly. And perhaps in that unflashy acceptance, Karl Malone finds a quiet kind of peace, not a reward for a life well lived, but the result of stopping the escape. When the noise is gone, when the role is over, what remains isn't glory or condemnation. It's a man standing tall in his present, not begging, not denying, just moving forward. Karl Malone closes his story, not with applause, but with a heavy silence, the kind of silence that appears only when a lifetime has walked its full path of endurance. If this is a tragedy, it's not the tragedy of sudden collapse, but of endurance stretched so far, there is no way out, no moment of salvation, no arms to embrace every mistake. Just a man who walked his entire life with labor, discipline, and endurance, and still had to stand before questions with no answers. America honors Karl Malone for very American things, working without cease, without excuses, without backing down. A man who goes to work every day, delivers on time, doesn't need to be loved to complete the task. In a culture that believes effort will be rewarded, Karl Malone is the most vivid proof. For nearly 2 decades, he showed up consistently, collided consistently, scored consistently. No noise, no dreams, no demands for privilege, just work, and work to the end. But that's exactly where the tragedy begins, because America also loves another story, the story of perfection. A complete hero, not just great on stage, but also righteous in life. Karl Malone doesn't fit that mold. He carries cracks that can't be hidden, mistakes that can't be erased, and the biggest void that American sports never fully forgives: no championship ring. So his greatness is placed next to a permanent minus, a cruel equation where everything he had is overshadowed by what he didn't. Karl Malone was never canonized, and perhaps he never wanted to be. He isn't a moral model to hang on the wall. He isn't a fairy tale to tell children before bed. He is a rough man, shaped by poverty, silence, and the absence of love. A man who learned to survive before learning to love, to endure before learning to understand himself. And what he didn't learn in time, he carried his whole life like a shadow. The American tragedy in Karl Malone's story lies here. We celebrate endurance, but rarely ask its price. We love those who never stop, but are surprised when they don't know how to live, when forced to stop. We build icons from discipline and labor, then turn away when we discover the person behind the icon isn't perfect. Karl Malone didn't fail for lack of effort. He failed because he absolutely believed effort would be enough. No moment in his life shows that more clearly than the 1997-1998 finals, when he touched the collective dream of American sports, the ring, and lost it in the most haunting way. From then on, everything he did was examined under the light of one question: why wasn't it enough? And for a man who gave everything, that question is the heaviest sentence, because it suggests that even if you do everything you were taught right, life can still refuse you. After retirement, when the noise stopped, Karl Malone didn't find a peaceful paradise. He found a void, an aching body, a mind facing past choices. He didn't seek public forgiveness, nor rewrite his story to be loved more. He kept living, quietly, with what couldn't be fixed. No redemption, just acceptance. That's not the ending America likes to hear, but it's the real one. And that's where the question for America needs to be asked, not to condemn but to reflect. We love greatness, but can we accept the imperfect human behind it? Can we honor labor without sanctifying it? Can we recognize discipline without demanding absolute purity? Can we tell a great story without flattening its uncomfortable edges? Karl Malone forces us to face those questions because he doesn't allow his story to be simplified. He isn't a complete hero, nor an easy villain. He is the result of a value system that teaches people to be strong before they can be weak, to do before they can feel, to endure before they can ask, "Are you okay?" When a society celebrates those values without preparing for their dark side, tragedy isn't the exception, it's the consequence. The final image of Karl Malone doesn't need lights, just a man who delivered mail his whole life, day after day, season after season, always on time, always completed. But there are letters, things he didn't get to say, emotions he didn't get to touch, collective dreams he didn't get to reach, that were never delivered. They got lost somewhere between expectation and reality, between effort and fate. That is the American tragedy of Karl Malone. Not because he wasn't great enough, but because that greatness was built in a way that left no room for healing, no support, no cushion, just forward, until no more forward was possible. And looking back, the most painful thing isn't the missing ring, it's the quiet question hanging in the air: is a lifetime of on-time delivery enough to arrive? If the destination was never defined for the man behind the work, Karl Malone in this story inspires both admiration and heartache, because he isn't America's storybook legend, but a laborer who stepped out of poverty with bare hands and a heart that learned silence too early. From harsh Louisiana, the youngest in a large family, growing up in a culture where men don't say love, don't ask feelings, then the foundational shock of his father's suicide, Karl wasn't taught how to grieve, so he chose to swallow the loss. That very silence turned basketball into a means of survival, not healing. And when he entered the NBA at pick 13 to the low-light Utah Jazz, he had to prove himself every day, to the point of forging himself into a machine that never dared rest. People honor him for MVPs, for historic scoring, for the cold pick and roll with Stockton that kept the Jazz always present, but the empty nights are the most painful part, aching body-mind that didn't know how to stop. Then the tragedy of 1997-1998 struck, just moments from the ring, but failure against Jordan and the Bulls turned no ring into a sentence, making him defensive and losing faith in the media. The final blow at the Lakers in 2003, 2004, worn body, desire intact, still didn't change fate, leaving a massive void when the noise stopped. The lesson for Americans lies in that very paradox. We praise grit and discipline, but we must learn to value mental health. Learn to rest, learn to face emotions before they turn into prolonged silence, and more importantly, be mature enough to see a legend as a human, honoring their labor and endurance, but not sanctifying them, not reducing their life to a ring or a label, because behind every icon, there is always a real life still being lived with scars that can't be fixed. If the story of Karl Malone makes you reflect on the price of greatness and what America often doesn't see behind the spotlight, subscribe to the channel to continue joining us on these real journeys. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video. where we keep telling imperfect but deeply human stories behind the legends.